The boy who would be king held his father's skull in his hands. He turned it slowly, running his fingertips across the contours of skinless bone. A thumb, still brown with field dirt, traced across the blunt ivory pegs of the gap-toothed death smile. He lifted his eyes to the stone shelf where the other skulls sat in silent vigil. They stared into the hut's gloomy confines, their eyes replaced by smooth stones, their faces restored with a crude artistry of clay. It was the boy's place to remake his father's face in the same way, sculpting the familiar features with wet mud and slow swipes of a flint knife, then letting the skull bake dry in the high sun. The boy thought he might use seashells for the eyes, if he could barter with the coastal traders for two that were smooth enough. He would do this soon. Such things were tradition. First, he needed answers. He turned the skull once more, circling his thumb across the ragged hole broken into the bone. He didn't need to close his eyes and meditate to know the truth. He didn't need to pray for his father's spirit to tell him what happened. He simply touched the hole in his father's head, and at once he knew. He saw the fall of the bronze knife from behind. He saw his father fall into the mud. He saw everything that happened leading to this moment in time. The boy who would be king rose from the floor of his family's hut and walked out into the settlement, his father's skull clutched in one hand. Mud brick huts lined both sides of the river. The wheat fields to the east were a patchwork sea of dark gold beneath the eye of the setting sun. The village was never truly quiet, even after the day's work was done. Families talked and laughed and fought. Dogs barked for attention and whined for food. The wind set the scrubland trees to singing, with the hiss of leaves and the creak of branches forming their eternal song. A ragged dog growled as the boy passed, yet fled yelping when he gave it no more than a glance. A carrion bird, hunchbacked and evil of eye, cried out above the village. A pack of other ragged children moved aside when he drew near, their ball game fading away and their eyes lowering. His barefooted walk took him unerringly to the house of his father's brother. The man, darkened and hardened by his years in the field, was sat outside the mud brick hut, threading beads onto a string for his youngest daughter. The boy's uncle uttered the sound that meant the boy's name. In response to this greeting, the boy held up his father's skull. Many centuries after these events, citizens of even civilized and advanced cultures would often misunderstand exactly what a myocardial infarction was. The savage, constricting pain in the chest was due to blood no longer flowing cleanly through the heart's passages, causing harm to the myocardium tissue of the heart itself. Put simply, the core of a human being runs dry, trying to function with no oxygenated lubricant. This happened to the boy's uncle when he set eyes upon the skull of his murdered brother. The boy who would be king watched with neither remorse nor any particular hostility. He looked on as his uncle slid from his crouch onto the mud, clutching his treacherous chest. He watched as his uncle's sun-darkened features pinched closed, ugly and tight in supreme agony as the older man shook with the onset of convulsions. He saw the necklace slip from his uncle's grip, the necklace that was being made for his young cousin, and would now never be finished. Others came running. They shouted. They cried. They made noises of language that spoke to panic and sorrow in a Proto-Indo-European tongue that would come to be known as an early precursor to the Hittite dialect. The boy walked away, heading back towards his family's hut. On the way, he turned to the figure, the giant, clad in gold, who walked nearby. Nord-Afric war clan tattoos curled on the towering warrior's face, curling from his temples to follow the curves of his cheekbones. The serpentine ink curves, white against his dark flesh, ended upon his chin just beneath his mouth. "Hello, Ra," the boy said in a tongue that wouldn't be spoken on this world for many thousands of years. The language was called High Gothic by those who would come to speak it. "You have never shown me this memory before," Ra said. The boy stared at him. "No, I have not. This is where it all began, Ra. Here on the banks of the Sakarya River." The boy turned his old eyes to the river itself. "So much water, so much life. If I have been disappointed by the galaxy's wonders, it is only because we were fortunate enough to grow in such a cradle. There is so much to learn, Ra, so much to know. It pleases me for you to see what it once was." The boy cast a slow gaze across their surroundings, across the rows of tall crops, around the village where every other man, woman, and child was ignoring them as though they did not exist. "This is where I spent my youth, working the soil and bringing life from the ground." The custodian inclined his head, causing the servos of his collar to purr. "I have given you my report, sire. Why do you keep me here?" "So I may illuminate you," the boy replied, speaking with a patience that bordered upon the preternatural. "You watched a man die, did you not?" Ra looked back over his shoulder, where the village folk were gathered around the fallen man, weeping and comforting in a loosed, unwashed herd. "I did." "That was my uncle, my father's brother." "You killed him," the custodian said without judgment. "Yes, he struck my father from behind with a piece of sharpened bronze too poorly made to even be called a knife. Men had killed one another for generations before my birth, but this was the first slaying that had resonance to me, that changed my existence. It was illuminating." He paused for a moment, following Ra's gaze back across the noisy villagers. "The very first murder was also a fratricide," he said without emotion. "Thousands of years before this, when men and women still owed as much to apes as to the form we now know. But it is curious to me. Brothers have always killed brothers. I wonder why that is. Some evolutionary flaw? Some ingrained emotional fragility written into mankind's corn, perhaps?" Ra shook his head. "I have no way of knowing the emotion at hand, sire. I have no brothers." "I was being rhetorical, Ra." The boy took a breath. This night was significant, not for the murder, but for the deliverance of justice. For my uncle's deed, I stopped his heart's function and forced him to die. In eras to come, this will be called lex talionis, the law of retaliation, or more simply, an eye for an eye. It is justice itself. Hundreds of human cultures through time will embrace it. Some will do so out of brutality, others from ideals that they believe to be fair and enlightened, but it is a precept that runs through the marrow of our species. Ra pulled his gaze away from the weeping humans. He heard his sire's words. He knew the history and philosophy behind them, but the reason for them yet eluded him. His doubt plainly showed on his face, for the boy inclined his head with recognition. "I told you that this is where it all began," the boy said. "Culture?" the warrior replied. "Civilization?" The boy's momentary silence told Ra that he had guessed wrong. "We are not far removed from those beginnings, Ra, either in distance or time. You could walk to the cradle of civilization from here, where men and women made the very first city. When I leave this village, that is where I will go. That journey is coming soon, but no, that is not what I mean when I speak of beginnings." The boy turned the skull over in his hands, just as he had done in the hut before. "This is where I first learned the truth behind our species. This very eve, as I held my father's skull and considered how to restore his features according to our burial rites. When I learned of his murder, it was a revelation into the heart of all mankind. This is a world that has no need of you yet, Ra. It has no need for imperial bodyguards, for it is a world that knows nothing of emperors, or warlords, or conquerors, and therefore it knows nothing of unity, nothing of law. You speak of leadership, the custodian said. Not quite. Every village already had leaders. Every family had patriarchs and matriarchs. I speak of kings, givers of law, rulers of cultures, not merely those who give orders, but those whose decisions keep a civilization bound together. This was the night I realized that mankind must be ruled. It could not be trusted to thrive without a master. It needed to be guided and shaped, bound by laws, and set to follow the course laid by its wisest minds. Ra breathed in the humid air of a land that knew nothing of the ravages it would suffer in the centuries to come. He smelled the sweat of the workers and the minerals in the river water, feeling his blood sting at the sensation of a truly unspoiled world. He didn't admire the crudeness of a people that lacked all but the rudiments of technology, but he felt awed at the species' humble genesis. To think that the emperor, revered above all, had risen from such beginnings. He looked the boy in the eyes, meeting that dark and knowing gaze, and spoke with a suspicion that curled the war-clan tattoos on his cheeks into a slight smile. Did this truly happen, sire? Were you really born here? The boy who would be king turned the skull over in his hands, his voice already distant with distraction. I shall barter with the coastal traders that come at the high moon. I will use shells for my father's eyes.